Naomi Bridges never imagined she'd find herself scraping dried leaves from a stone path in the middle of a sleepy neighborhood outside Baltimore, much less that she would enjoy it. For years, her life had been neatly folded into the confines of a boutique flower studio she owned in the city. Bridges Botanicals, known for its rare imports and bespoke arrangements for upscale clients. But success had a cost. Long hours, escalating rents, and a burnout that didn't come all at once but slowly, like mist creeping in under a door. By the time she realized she no longer wanted to wake up to 10 voicemails about Japanese orchids or lavender centerpieces, she had already emotionally disconnected from the very thing she once loved. So, when the lease on her storefront was up, she didn't renew it. She sold off the remaining inventory, shut the doors without ceremony, and packed her life into a moving truck headed for the suburbs. She didn't choose the house for its school district, or for the open-plan kitchen, or because she wanted a backyard for entertaining, like so many of the other listings touted. No, Naomi chose it because of the pool, not a sparkling blue status symbol carved into concrete with blaring speakers and an inflatable unicorn, but a modest kidney-shaped basin tucked behind tall hedges, shaded by mature oak trees that bent with the wind. The tile was cracked in places, the lights no longer worked, and the water had long since turned the color of tarnished copper. But to Naomi, it felt like a buried relic waiting to be reclaimed. It was quiet here. Private. The kind of place where no one would ask about her plans, her resume, her 5-year trajectory. Where she could breathe. The first few weeks were spent in a kind of structured solitude. Naomi kept herself busy with the kind of work that left her hands dirty and her body aching, but gave her something she hadn't felt in months: clarity. She pulled weeds until her palms blistered, sanded and restained the worn deckboards, and scrubbed years of neglect from the patio furniture that the previous owners had left behind. Every morning she'd brew a cup of dark coffee, walk barefoot through the dew-damp grass, and stand at the pool's edge, mentally noting what had changed, what needed attention, what could wait. It became ritual. Restoring the pool was not a weekend project. It was a full-scale reclamation. Naomi hired a reputable local contractor to help reline the basin, install a new filtration system, and seal the surrounding tile. It cost her more than she'd initially budgeted, but she didn't flinch. She saw it as an investment not in property value, but in peace of mind. By the time the work was finished, the pool had become something else entirely, a living part of the home. The gentle hum of the filtration pump, the scent of chlorine tinged with late-blooming jasmine, the way the sun rippled through the water in the early hours. It all came together like a kind of quiet symphony. Naomi didn't throw a housewarming party. She didn't invite anyone over to see the transformation. She simply swam, at dawn, at dusk, in silence. Her solitude was not loneliness, but choice. It was during one of these early morning swims that she noticed the first sign of intrusion: a juice box floating listlessly near the steps. At first, she thought maybe a bird had dropped it in, or a raccoon had scavenged nearby and accidentally knocked it in. She fished it out, disposed of it, and forgot about it. But a few days later, there was a plastic hair clip at the bottom of the shallow end, and a half-eaten granola bar on one of the deck chairs. These were not acts of wildlife. Someone had been here. She double-checked the gate, still latched. The side fence, no signs of damage. Naomi brushed it off as coincidence, or maybe an old neighbor cutting through the yard, unaware the house had changed hands. But the pattern continued, subtly at first. Soggy towels left over the fence, footprints on the wet tile when she hadn't gone outside. Once, she even found a pink pool noodle bobbing at the far end. It was as if her sanctuary was being slowly, deliberately co-opted. It was around this time that she first met Karen. Naomi had just returned from a supply run, bags of mulch and a new pH testing kit for the pool, and was unloading the trunk when she heard the unmistakable shuffle of sandals on asphalt. She turned to see a woman approaching from the adjacent driveway, her gait brisk, purposeful, her smile rehearsed. "Hi there, you must be new." "I'm Karen, I live right next door," she said, as if that explained the intrusion. She was in her 60s, trim, with a brightly patterned blouse and gold jewelry that caught the sun. Naomi offered a polite hello, expecting a brief exchange, maybe a welcome to the neighborhood and a return to silence. But Karen had other plans. "I just had to say, the pool looks amazing. We were all wondering if someone was finally going to clean it up after the Barlows left." "That thing was an eyesore," she continued, glancing over Naomi's shoulder toward the backyard. Naomi smiled stiffly, murmured a thanks, and bent to retrieve another bag of mulch. "My grandkids love pools," Karen added casually. "They've been begging me to let them swim, and I told them, well, maybe if the new neighbor's nice." She laughed, as though it were already decided. Naomi straightened, her fingers tightening around the paper handle. "I'm keeping it private, actually," she said firmly but politely. "It's more of a personal retreat." Karen's expression faltered for just a second before recovering. "Oh, of course, I totally get it. I just figured, it's summer and kids need a place to be kids. Especially around here. It gets so quiet. But hey, no worries, I'm sure we'll figure something out." Naomi didn't answer. She simply nodded, excused herself, and finished unloading her car. But the interaction lingered the way something minor does when you know instinctively that it wasn't minor at all. In the days that followed, Naomi became acutely aware of how visible her backyard was from Karen's second-floor windows. She started closing the curtains when she swam. She began locking the side gate, even during the day. One afternoon, while pruning the lavender bushes near the fence line, she heard children's laughter. Sharp, giddy, uncontrolled. She peeked through the hedges and saw two small boys running in circles on Karen's lawn, both shirtless, water guns in hand. Karen was lounging in a deck chair with a magazine. When her eyes met Naomi's, she smiled and waved like nothing was wrong. The next time Naomi found the side gate unlatched and muddy footprints leading from the shallow end to her garden bench, she didn't brush it off. She walked straight to Karen's house and rang the bell. "Oh, hello," Karen answered, as though surprised to see her. "Everything all right?" "Your grandchildren were in my backyard again," Naomi said flatly. "I found snacks in the pool, the gate was open, and someone knocked over a planter." Karen's face tightened. "Oh, I'm sure they didn't mean any harm. They're just kids. You know how it is." "I don't think you understand," Naomi said, her voice low but steady. "It's not a community pool, it's mine. I've put a lot of time and money into it, and I'm not comfortable with anyone being back there without my permission. I need this to stop." Karen held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then forced a smile. "Of course, I'll talk to them. No problem at all." But Naomi knew better. There was no apology, no accountability, only the thinly veiled irritation of someone not used to being told no. That night, Naomi sat on her deck, the pool lights casting soft ripples across the water, and thought about what she had built here. This wasn't just about trespassing or messes or children being children. It was about intrusion, erosion, a slow unraveling of the boundaries she had so carefully set. Not just physical ones, but emotional ones. And something told her this was only the beginning. 2 days later, Naomi returned home earlier than usual, having skipped her normal errand stop at the nursery after a long client call had drained her of energy. The sun was still high, casting a honeyed light across the lawn, and for a moment, everything looked exactly how it should. Peaceful, undisturbed, silent. She pulled into the driveway, opened the trunk to retrieve a bag of organic fertilizer she'd picked up earlier in the week but forgotten to unpack, and moved toward the side of the house that led to the garden path and the gate to the backyard. But when she rounded the corner, the sensation hit her like a slap. The faint echo of splashing, the rapid cadence of children's laughter, distinct and close. Her pulse quickened, not in fear but in that sharp, hot swell of disbelief that comes when you already know what you're about to see but wish, somehow, that you're wrong. She walked faster, jaw set, and as she reached the gate, it confirmed everything she suspected. The pool was occupied. 2 children were inside, maybe 6 or 7 years old, shrieking and kicking at each other in the shallow end. Pool toys she had never purchased were floating across the surface. A neon green beach ball, a plastic boat, a deflated water wing. Nearby, her lounge chairs had been rearranged haphazardly, and one of the white cushions had a large, muddy footprint smeared across it. And there, reclined beneath the shade umbrella as though she belonged there, sat Karen. She had on large sunglasses, her shoes off and resting beside her chair, a straw tote open at her feet with a half-eaten bag of chips visible from where Naomi stood. Her expression when she finally noticed Naomi was serene, almost amused. Naomi didn't speak at first. She walked slowly across the deck, her sandals smacking lightly against the wooden planks until she was close enough to look Karen in the eyes. The older woman looked up, blinked once, then offered a lazy smile. "Oh, Naomi, you're home early. The boys were getting so restless, I figured we'd sneak in a little swim. Hope that's okay. It's just so hot today." Naomi didn't smile. Her voice came out flat. "It's not okay. I've told you before. This is private property." Karen's smile barely wavered, but her tone cooled by a few degrees. I know, but they're just children. And really, what's the harm? We were planning to leave in a bit anyway. They weren't doing anything wrong." Naomi gestured toward the mess. "You've moved my furniture, tracked dirt everywhere, and let them play in a pool that isn't yours." "You didn't ask, Karen. You came onto my property and acted like it was yours." Karen stood, slowly brushing imaginary crumbs off her shorts. "Now let's not make this dramatic. I didn't think you'd mind. You weren't using it. And besides, my husband always said this side of the yard was part of the old boundary line before the Barlows fenced it in. Technically, it might not even be yours. I could pull up some of the original plans if it makes you feel better." Naomi took a step closer, her tone sharpening. "You can pull up whatever stories you like. I have the deed. I have the survey. This is my land, and I'm asking you, no, telling you, to leave. Now." Karen narrowed her eyes behind the tinted lenses, her mouth twitching as if holding back a retort. She turned and called the boys. "Time to go, boys! Dry off!" They groaned in protest but obeyed. Naomi stood still as they gathered their things, dripping water across the tile, one of them knocking over a potted succulent that Naomi had just repotted the day before. Karen didn't even acknowledge it. She packed slowly, deliberately, and then as she passed Naomi, she leaned in with a voice too quiet for the children to hear. "You know, Naomi, some neighbors don't like to share. That's their choice. But it says something, doesn't it, about the kind of person they are?" Naomi didn't answer. She watched them leave, the trail of wet footprints a quiet insult, and didn't move until the gate clicked shut behind them. The adrenaline left her all at once, replaced by an overwhelming numbness. She felt like someone had cracked open her ribs and reached inside. Not violently, but carelessly, as if her space, her peace, her rules were nothing more than a suggestion to be ignored at will. That evening, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, staring at the handwritten list she'd started weeks ago titled, "Backyard Improvements." The pen hovered in her hand, but the calm, optimistic mood with which she had once written, "Replace lights," "plant," "rosemary," and "stain deck" had evaporated. She scratched through the list slowly, almost mechanically. The words felt like they belonged to another life, one where the idea of boundary was respected, where privacy meant something, where someone else's space was not up for public negotiation. The next morning, Naomi called her lawyer. Not to start a war, but to understand the rules of engagement. Alice Carter was a no-nonsense type who had helped her close the property months earlier, and she picked up on the second ring. Naomi explained what happened, laid out every detail she could remember, and asked a simple question. "What recourse do I have if someone keeps trespassing and denies wrongdoing?" Alice sighed. "It's not uncommon, unfortunately, especially in older neighborhoods where people get used to treating each other's yards like shared space. But here's the thing, your deed defines your property line. If you have that and your survey confirms it, anyone entering your land without permission is trespassing. Full stop. I'd advise you to document everything. Photos, dates, anything you notice. Install a lock if you haven't already. And if it continues, we can send a cease and desist letter before escalating." Naomi thanked her, wrote down the steps, and decided this time she wasn't going to be passive. She had already tried courtesy. Now she would follow procedure. She purchased a heavy-duty latch for the gate that afternoon, and a second padlock for the fence door on the opposite end. She marked a calendar and began noting every small anomaly. A trampled patch of thyme near the garden bed, a missing solar light, a wrapper caught in the hedges. She didn't want to believe Karen would keep pushing, but that belief faded fast when, 3 days later, she came home to find the lock on the gate clipped clean through, and in the water, floating like a flag, was one of her floral cushions, soaked and stained. That night, Naomi didn't sleep well. She dreamed of rising tides, of locked doors that wouldn't stay shut, of voices on the other side of walls she couldn't see through. When she woke, the dread she'd felt in the dream clung to her ribs like a weight. She made coffee, sat by the kitchen window, and looked out at the now silent pool. The water was calm again, but not clean. It had taken on a cloudy, off-blue hue, no doubt from whatever mess had been dragged into it. Her sanctuary had become a contested space, a place of waiting for what, she wasn't sure. By noon, she had booked a consultation with a property security firm. She didn't want cameras everywhere, didn't want to live like she was under siege, but she needed at least one set of eyes. Not for revenge. For confirmation. The technician arrived the following day and installed a discreet camera above the garden shed, angled perfectly to cover the gate and part of the pool. Naomi felt no satisfaction, only a dull resignation. The lines were drawn. All that remained was what would happen next, and it came sooner than she expected. 3 days later, a manila envelope appeared in her mailbox. No return address, just her name in block letters. Inside was a note, handwritten in large, loopy script. "You're making things harder than they need to be. Let the kids swim. Be neighborly. We've all used that pool for years." Folded with the note was a printed photo, grainy but unmistakable. It was of her, from the back, sitting at the edge of the pool in her robe, feet in the water. Taken from beyond the hedge line. Naomi stared at the image for a long time. Then she placed it flat on the table, set a paperweight on top to keep it from curling, and dialed Alice again. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It was calm, cold, certain. "It's time," she said. "Let's make this official." The cease and desist letter was delivered by courier on a Wednesday afternoon, just after a light summer rain had passed through and left the neighborhood smelling of damp mulch and concrete. Naomi didn't watch as it was handed to Karen. She had no desire to witness the performance she was certain would follow. The indignation, the hand-on-heart disbelief, the inevitable passive-aggressive monologue about neighborly values. Instead, she remained inside, seated at her desk, reviewing the email Alice had sent confirming the delivery and summarizing the contents. The letter was clear, professional, and utterly unambiguous. Any further entry onto Naomi's property without permission would be treated as trespassing and referred to the authorities. The message, for anyone reasonable, would have ended the matter. But Karen was not reasonable. That evening, Naomi walked the perimeter of her yard to inspect the new security signage that had gone up earlier that day. It wasn't aggressive, just simple notices posted near the fence and beside the gate that informed visitors the property was under video surveillance and that unauthorized access was prohibited. She had no desire to turn her home into a fortress, but the signs were necessary now, as much for legal clarity as for psychological deterrence. She paused near the hedge where the photo had likely been taken and scanned the space for gaps or disturbances, her eyes trailing over the soil and undergrowth with quiet calculation. The weight of being watched had not left her. It nestled in her ribs and turned even the silence of her backyard into something unsteady. The next morning began quietly enough. Naomi spent the early hours tending to the damaged herb bed, replacing crushed thyme and marjoram with new clippings from a nursery she trusted. The work was meditative, her hands moving with practiced precision, but the calm was short-lived. As she rose to wipe her forehead, a shadow caught her eye just beyond the far corner of the fence. 2 boys, Karen's grandsons, stood on the sidewalk, throwing stones at a rusted garden gnome she had placed near the front walkway. Naomi walked slowly to the edge of the lawn, her expression unreadable. She didn't shout, didn't call out, just stood still until one of them noticed and elbowed the other. They took off running before she could say a word, their laughter echoing back over their shoulders. By early afternoon, she had reviewed the previous night's camera footage. At 2:14 a.m., a figure, small, thin, hood pulled tight, had approached the gate and jiggled the handle before turning and walking away. The video was clear, the timestamp bold. Naomi forwarded it to Alice with the subject line, "Another attempt." There was no longer any pretense of misunderstanding. The pattern was now deliberate and calculated. Alice's reply came quickly. "I'll contact the local precinct directly. You're not filing alone. I'll make sure it's taken seriously." Within 24 hours, a community liaison officer had called Naomi to schedule a visit. Officer Lane was in his early 50s, polite and professional, with a face that suggested he'd seen his share of neighborhood disputes. He reviewed the footage without commentary, took a statement, and nodded slowly. "It's not just kids being kids," he said quietly, glancing out the window toward the fence. "They're targeting you. Subtly, but definitely." He took a few additional notes and assured her a report would be filed. "This is the kind of thing that escalates. We'll increase patrols. If they step foot on your property again, call immediately." Naomi thanked him, though the words tasted like ash. She wasn't the kind of person who wanted to involve law enforcement. She didn't crave authority or retribution, only peace. But her restraint had yielded only intrusion, and now, even the fence line no longer felt like a barrier. That weekend, Naomi hosted her sister Evelyn for a long overdue visit. The two hadn't seen each other in months, and the reunion should have been one of warmth and familiarity, of shared wine and laughter over forgotten childhood stories. But the atmosphere was different now. As they sat on the patio with glasses of chilled Pinot Grigio, Naomi found herself scanning the perimeter, watching for movement beyond the hedges. Evelyn noticed. "Is this about that neighbor you mentioned?" she asked, voice soft. Naomi nodded. "It's not just awkward anymore. It's become something else. A campaign, maybe, or a test." Evelyn set down her glass and leaned forward. "Then you need to make it clear this isn't a game. End it before it gets worse." It was good advice, but Naomi wasn't sure how to apply it. The situation had crept so slowly from nuisance to violation that reacting felt like chasing smoke, until the next incident made the escalation unmistakable. On Tuesday morning, Naomi opened her back door and stepped outside only to freeze mid-step. The pool, which had been perfectly clear the night before, now resembled a brackish pond. Floating on the surface was a sticky mass of trash. Plastic wrappers, torn foam, a half-eaten sandwich pressed against the skimmer grate. The water was cloudy, tinted green, the pump clogged and wheezing as it struggled against the blockage. And at the bottom of the deep end, barely visible, was something large and shapeless. Naomi grabbed the pool net and began fishing through the debris. After several tense minutes, she hooked the object and pulled it to the surface. A soaked, ruined, stuffed animal. A dolphin. One of the toys she'd seen in Karen's yard weeks ago. Naomi stood at the edge of the pool, arm dripping, the dead toy sagging in the net, and felt her stomach twist. This wasn't petty anymore. This wasn't ignorance or boundary testing. This was sabotage. She contacted the maintenance team she had worked with during the pool's renovation. They arrived within hours, drained the water, disassembled the filter, and spent nearly 6 hours disinfecting the system. One of the technicians pulled her aside near dusk, holding a split pipe and a cluster of matted debris. "Someone poured something in," he said. "Grease, maybe, or syrup. The inside of the lines are coated. This wasn't accidental." The bill was over $1,200. She forwarded the invoice to Alice the next morning. "Add this to the file," she wrote. "I want full restitution." The response was swift. Alice filed for an injunction and prepared the civil complaint for property damage. Naomi didn't know whether it would go to court or if Karen would finally take the message seriously, but she no longer cared. The pool was not a toy. Her home was not a playground. And if legal action was the only language Karen understood, so be it. 3 days later, Naomi received a letter in the mail. Not certified, not formal, but scrawled in blue ink on a lined sheet of notepad paper. It read, in uneven script, "If you don't want the kids in the water, then maybe you shouldn't have put it there. This neighborhood was better before you." No signature, no return address. Just a final sour confirmation that what she was dealing with wasn't just one woman's entitlement, but a broader rot. A belief that access meant ownership, that presence meant permission. She folded the letter once, slowly, and placed it in the same file where she had kept the rest. When she closed the folder, she didn't sigh or cry or seethe. She simply set it aside, walked out to the edge of her once pristine pool, and looked at the water as the evening light shimmered across its surface. It would not happen again. One way or another, this was ending. It was one of those midsummer mornings when the air already clung to the skin before the sun had even risen fully above the tree line. And yet Naomi felt none of the usual peace that came with her early rituals. She had stopped brewing coffee outside, stopped sitting on the edge of the pool with her legs dangling lazily in the water. Instead, she paced. There was an unfamiliar tension in her limbs. Not quite anxiety, but something harder. Calculated, compressed, waiting for release. The damage to the pool had been repaired, but the trust, the sense of sanctuary she had worked so hard to build, had been fundamentally breached. Naomi had spent the last 2 weeks logging incidents, collecting records, forwarding everything to Alice and to Officer Lane, who now called her by her first name and always answered on the second ring. She appreciated his presence, his calm, procedural patience, but even he had admitted that the threshold for criminal charges in these kinds of neighbor disputes was high and often unhelpful. "Civil court's your best shot," he had said bluntly. "You're doing the right thing. Just don't expect miracles." Naomi didn't expect miracles. She expected escalation. So when the letter from the zoning department arrived, neatly typed, bearing the official insignia of the Municipal Development Office, Naomi wasn't surprised, only momentarily disoriented by the sheer boldness of it. The letter cited an anonymous complaint against her for unauthorized structural modifications to backyard property, specifically naming the pool and surrounding deck area as unpermitted and potentially in violation of code. The language was vague but urgent, instructing her to provide copies of all construction approvals and architectural documentation within 10 business days or face a mandatory inspection and potential fines. Naomi read the letter twice, then a third time, before placing it carefully beside the stack of papers she had already accumulated. She didn't even need to speculate who filed the complaint. The fingerprints were too obvious, the timing too perfect. But unlike Karen, Naomi kept everything. She had folders, receipts, digital copies of every approved permit, signed off by the same department now demanding them. She called Alice that afternoon, forwarded the letter, and said with icy calm, "It's another move. They're trying to wear me down." Alice agreed. "They're throwing paperwork at you now, hoping something sticks. But we'll bury this in documentation. I'll draft a formal reply and CC the building inspector's office. Do not contact anyone yourself. We'll handle this by the book." By the book. Naomi had clung to that principle since this all began. No yelling, no confrontation, no open hostility. Only facts and proof and the relentless clarity of someone who refuses to be cornered. But clarity did not mean calm. That evening, as she reviewed camera footage from the previous week, she paused on a still frame. Karen, pausing at the edge of the property, looking not toward the house but directly into the lens. Her mouth was set in something between a smile and a sneer. She had known the camera was there. Naomi had never hidden it, but there was something about the stillness of her posture, the almost theatrical way she seemed to acknowledge the surveillance. That unsettled Naomi in a way none of the previous incidents had. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Naomi closed the laptop and sat in silence. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even angry in the way she had been before. She was calculating now, and calculation came with clarity. She picked up her phone and called a landscaping contractor whose number she'd saved months ago during her initial renovation. His name was Victor, and he specialized in hardscape conversions, transforming pools, fountains, and outdated water features into functional stonework gardens or green spaces. She asked if he had availability for a consultation and made it clear what she was considering. "It's an old pool," she said. "I'm thinking of filling it, making something else, something permanent." Victor arrived 3 days later. He was quiet, professional, measured in his assessment. He walked the perimeter of the pool, took notes, asked a few questions about the drainage, the piping, the sublayer. Naomi gave him the specs, and when he asked about the urgency, she didn't offer details, just said, "Sooner is better." The estimate arrived the next morning. It was high. Concrete work was never cheap, and she was asking for a full pour. Not soil, not gravel, but solid coverage reinforced for permanence. It was a statement, a severance, and she paid it in full. By the end of the week, the crew arrived. Naomi didn't watch them work. She stayed inside, curtains half drawn, the windows closed to muffle the mechanical rhythm of the cement mixer and the dull thud of the wet aggregate being poured and smoothed. She made tea. She answered emails. She filed another report with Officer Lane documenting the zoning letter and the timeline of the latest developments. And when the noise finally stopped and the trucks drove away, Naomi stepped outside for the first time. The pool was gone. In its place was a flat, perfect slate of concrete, still faintly damp, catching the light like a new scar. The outline of what once was could still be seen if you knew where to look. The slope of the shallow end, the slight indentation of the steps, but to the casual eye it was clean and deliberate. Victor had even left room for planters, as requested, which Naomi planned to fill with succulents and ornamental grasses. Plants that thrived on heat and neglect. She didn't intend to host anyone. She wasn't building a patio. She was reclaiming territory. The next morning, the reaction came. It began with shouting. Naomi was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the voice. Shrill, incredulous, unmistakably Karen. She stepped onto the porch, phone in hand, but not recording, simply observing. Karen stood on the sidewalk just beyond the property line, gesturing wildly at the new concrete, her grandsons beside her with blank expressions. "You filled it in?" Karen shouted. "What kind of bitter, selfish person does something like that? That pool's been part of this neighborhood longer than you've even lived here." Naomi said nothing. She didn't move. She watched. Karen continued, her voice cracking. "You think this makes you powerful? You think ruining something beautiful proves a point? You've poisoned the whole block with your arrogance." Naomi stepped down the porch slowly, not to engage, but to make her presence undeniable. She didn't look away. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Everyone's talking about you, you'll see. You're not welcome here. Not anymore." Naomi turned, walked back inside, and closed the door without a word. That night, she stood on the edge of the hardened concrete, the air warm and silent around her. She placed the first planter, tall agave in a ceramic pot, at the center of the space where the deep end once curved. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't even feel vindicated. What she felt was done, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without waking once. The silence that followed the cement pour was brief, and Naomi had expected as much. She had long since stopped believing in resolution through reason, and she knew that the act of erasing the pool, of reclaiming her own space in such a definitive and visible way, would not be accepted quietly. Karen had built her campaign on a foundation of entitlement, masked as tradition, and people like her didn't respond to loss with grace. Naomi wasn't looking for peace anymore, she was looking for finality. But finality, like most things worth achieving, had to be earned in full. The first sign that things were not over came 3 days later in the form of a letter. Not from Karen, not from the city, but from a local legal service that represented neighborhood interest groups. The letter was formal, almost performative in tone, and accused Naomi of willfully degrading communal cohesion and removing a shared amenity in violation of unspoken local customs. The words meant nothing legally. Alice confirmed this immediately, but they were crafted to sound authoritative, and that was the point. It wasn't about legality, it was about optics, pressure, implied isolation. The letter ended with a phrase Naomi read twice, more out of disbelief than confusion. "We strongly urge you to reconsider your antagonistic stance toward established neighborly expectations and explore restorative options." She sent it straight to Alice, who replied with a brief note. "They're baiting you. Do not respond. We'll file for a cease letter on harassment next." Naomi didn't reply. She had stopped wasting words, but she began to notice things. Trash reappeared on her lawn in small, deliberate patterns. Juice boxes wedged upright, cookie wrappers weighted with pebbles so they wouldn't blow away. Her mailbox was left open each morning, not stolen from, just violated. The door hanging down like a broken jaw. Once she found a single garden glove left on her back steps, soaked through and smelling faintly of chlorine. The concrete slab remained untouched, but the space around it grew increasingly marked by the fingerprints of provocation. Naomi reported each incident. She had learned to document everything: photographs, timestamps, written descriptions. Officer Lane visited twice more, took statements, forwarded paperwork to the district clerk. He was sympathetic, thorough, but always careful in what he promised. "Legally, you're protected," he said, his voice tinged with fatigue. "Socially, that's harder. They're not breaking laws, they're sending messages." The most egregious message came on a Sunday morning. Naomi woke early, as she usually did, and went to open the back curtains when something caught her attention outside. At first, it looked like a stain across the concrete, dark and irregular. But when she stepped onto the deck, the smell hit her. Rotten eggs, spoiled meat. A mix of substances poured directly onto the surface of the new slab. Someone had emptied garbage bags across the space and arranged them in a wide arc, forming a crude half-circle facing her kitchen windows. There were chicken bones, rotting fruit, and something that might once have been a sponge cake, now crawling with ants. At the center, written in what looked like mustard or some other thick yellow paste, was the word witch. Naomi stood there for a long moment, unblinking. Then she went back inside, called the police, and waited. This time, it was a different officer who responded. A younger man named Herrera, polite but clearly uncertain of what he had walked into. He photographed the mess, took her statement, and asked if she had any enemies. Naomi didn't laugh. "Just one," she said, "and she lives over there." She pointed across the property line to Karen's home. Herrera nodded, wrote something down, and asked if she wanted to press charges. Naomi hesitated. She didn't want a court battle over trash, but she wanted the pattern on record. She asked that the incident be logged as vandalism, with photos attached to the ongoing file under Officer Lane's supervision. Herrera obliged and left with quiet efficiency. After the cleanup, Naomi went to her shed and took out a package she hadn't planned on using: heavy-duty solar motion lights with an integrated alarm system. She mounted one above the garden entrance and another above the old gate, positioning both to cover the entire backyard perimeter. They weren't subtle, and she didn't want them to be. That evening, the soft clicking of the automatic lights punctuated the dusk like a warning shot. And yet, the next act came not from the shadows but in broad daylight. 2 days later, as Naomi returned from a grocery run, she saw a small group of neighbors gathered on Karen's front lawn. At first, she thought it might be a yard sale, but as she parked and stepped out, she noticed the signs. Handwritten on poster board, propped against folding chairs or held aloft: "Bring back the pool," "Neighborhood belongs to all," and "No room for selfishness." The protest was small, 6 people at most, but loud in its symbolism. Karen stood in the center, animated, speaking to a man with a camera on a tripod who appeared to be filming a statement. Naomi didn't approach. She didn't need to. Her phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn, who had seen a post online. "Karen's going public," it read. "Someone uploaded a video of her ranting about you stealing joy from children." Naomi didn't watch the video. She forwarded the message to Alice, who advised against any response. "Don't engage in the arena they've chosen. That's not where we win." But that night, as Naomi sat on her porch and watched the flickering motion lights illuminate the now clean concrete slab, she realized something had changed, not in them, but in her. They wanted her to react. They wanted her to rage, to argue, to fall apart in public. But Naomi no longer felt exposed. She felt resolved, and that made her dangerous. The next morning, she went to the county office and requested a formal copy of her property boundaries. She requested a notarized copy of her permits, her renovation approvals, and the report from the sanitation crew that had cleaned the vandalism. She built a second file, this one physical, thick, precise, unshakable. She delivered a copy to Alice, a second to Officer Lane, and a third she kept by her door. That same afternoon, she had her insurance company conduct a second assessment of the property value post-renovation. When asked for the reason, she said, "Ongoing dispute. I want everything current." It was during that assessment that Naomi noticed something strange. Near the edge of the eastern fence line, a stake had been moved. A small survey marker, part of the original border, now tilted awkwardly as if it had been pulled up and reinserted. She crouched down, studied the surrounding soil, and saw the faint impression of a boot tread nearby. She didn't touch it. She photographed it. Then she emailed Alice and Lane again. "This," she wrote, "was meant to provoke a legal misstep. I won't give them one." But Karen did. Later that week, a city official arrived unannounced to conduct an informal boundary review. Naomi asked for ID, verified his credentials, and then, calmly, without anger, presented him with her documentation. When he asked about the neighbor's claims of shared fencing agreements, she handed him a copy of the official deed and a photograph of the repositioned stake. The man blinked, said little, and promised to file a formal report. She never saw him again. The last escalation didn't come in the form of letters or garbage or crowds. It came one evening when Naomi returned home and found her front door lock tampered with. Not broken, not forced, but scratched, as though someone had attempted to insert the wrong key multiple times. Inside, nothing was missing, no signs of entry, but on her kitchen table, placed neatly beside her closed laptop, was a single object. One of the old pool toys, the green plastic boat that had floated in her water weeks ago, now dry and gleaming under the kitchen light. Naomi didn't scream. She didn't call anyone. She picked up the boat, turned it over in her hand once, and placed it in the trash. Then she opened her security console and downloaded every second of the past 48 hours of footage. She sent the files to Alice. Then she called Lane. This time she didn't ask for help. She asked for a restraining order, and she had the evidence to get one. The court hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in early August, and the air in the city was already thick with the kind of soupy heat that made even breathing feel like work. Naomi arrived early, dressed not for intimidation but for clarity. Tailored slacks, pressed blouse, no makeup except a neutral lip balm, and a leather folder tucked under one arm containing the final sorted collection of every photo, invoice, report, and affidavit tied to the months-long unraveling of her piece. She didn't bring a friend or a family member. She didn't need a gallery. What she needed was a decision. Alice met her at the courthouse entrance, expression firm, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense twist, eyes scanning the hallway with the watchful readiness of someone who had long stopped underestimating petty antagonism in quiet zip codes. Karen arrived exactly 4 minutes before the hearing, trailing a woman in her 30s, her daughter likely, the one Naomi had only seen in passing, always distant, vaguely embarrassed. Karen was dressed for effect. Large sunglasses, conservative jacket, and an expression meant to evoke fatigue and wounded propriety. When their eyes met across the small waiting room, Karen didn't flinch, but she didn't smile either. Her mouth was tight, her shoulders set, as if preparing for a battle she still believed could be won through sheer performance. Naomi looked away first, not out of weakness, but because Karen was no longer the center of this conflict. The legal weight was. The judge assigned to their case was a woman in her 60s, with an air of quiet intelligence and no patience for theater. As the proceedings began, Alice spoke first. Direct, concise, laying out the events chronologically, building a picture not of a neighborly spat, but of a sustained campaign of harassment, property violation, and attempted intimidation. She presented the camera footage, the zoning complaint history, the mail tampering, the garbage incidents, and the physical evidence of the pool sabotage. When she handed over the city inspector's signed statement confirming Naomi's compliance with all permits and boundary regulations, the judge nodded once, clearly noting the credibility. Karen's defense was less coherent. Her lawyer, a polite but visibly underprepared man in an ill-fitted suit, attempted to frame the incidents as misunderstandings, children's energy, conflicting lifestyles, lack of communication. Karen herself was permitted to speak briefly, and her tone oscillated between condescending pity and performative sorrow. "I only ever wanted to keep the spirit of the neighborhood alive," she said, voice trembling at the edges. The pool was part of that spirit. Naomi never made an effort to be part of this community. I feared for the boys. They just needed somewhere to go. Naomi remained still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react. When asked if she had anything to add, she stood, opened her folder, and handed the bailiff the restraining order request, backed by police reports, video, sworn statements, and the tampered lock photo. Her voice was low even. "I don't want apologies. I don't want compensation. I want distance. Permanently." The judge took a long pause before speaking. She reviewed the papers in silence, lips pressed into a thoughtful line, then folded her hands on the desk and delivered the ruling. The restraining order was granted in full. Karen and all persons acting on her behalf were legally barred from stepping foot on Naomi's property, communicating with her directly or indirectly, or initiating any civil interference for a period of 2 years, with violations subject to immediate legal action. In addition, the judge ordered restitution in the amount of $13,460, covering the property damage, the pool sanitization, legal fees, and security installation costs. Karen's daughter paled visibly. Karen herself remained frozen, her expression vacant, as though she had expected some kind of last-minute redemption that never arrived. The gavel struck once, and it was done. Outside the courthouse, Naomi didn't celebrate. She didn't speak. She stepped into the sunlight, exhaled slowly, and walked to her car without looking back. It was not a victory that needed confetti. It was a conclusion. Clean, absolute. In the days that followed, the neighborhood grew quieter. The signs disappeared from Karen's lawn. The sidewalk gatherings ceased. Naomi's mail arrived untouched. Trash stopped appearing near her gates, and perhaps most telling, Karen herself seemed to vanish. Shades drawn, car unmoved, lawn slowly growing wild. Some whispered that she was staying with her daughter for a while. Others speculated she'd left entirely. Naomi didn't care to know. She had no desire to track her adversary's retreat. She had her own space to reclaim, and that space was no longer shadowed by confrontation. She planted lavender around the edge of the concrete slab. Not for irony, not to reclaim anything symbolic, but because she liked the scent. She added 3 large planters, tall, rust-colored urns filled with sage and cactus, and arranged them in a triangle that framed the quiet, solid surface that had once been the pool. The stone was clean now, power-washed and sealed, its texture soft beneath her feet in the evening hours when she walked out with tea to stand in silence. One night, as the sun dipped behind the houses and shadows stretched long across the yard, Naomi lit a lantern, set it on the center of the slab, and stood quietly watching the flame dance against the growing dark. It was not a vigil. It was not a ritual. It was acknowledgement that some battles are not fought with screams or vengeance, but with evidence, patience, and a refusal to be pushed off your own ground. Naomi didn't win by fighting louder. She won by not moving. By late September, the light had changed. The brutal, overbearing weight of summer had lifted, and in its place came a softness Naomi hadn't realized she'd been craving. A cooler sun, quieter mornings, and evenings that carried the scent of earth rather than chlorine. The lavender she had planted around the slab had taken well to the soil, sprouting with quiet confidence and releasing their fragrance each time a breeze moved through the yard. It was not a garden in the traditional sense. It wasn't sculpted or delicate or ornamental. It was resilient. Each plant was chosen not for its aesthetic, but for its endurance, for its ability to thrive under pressure, to hold its color in drought, and to bloom when left alone. Naomi stood barefoot on the concrete most mornings now, holding her tea, letting the stone's residual heat from the previous day warm her feet, her eyes drifting not toward the neighboring houses, but upward, toward the open, unobstructed sky. There were no more signs, no more flyers tucked into mailboxes or left taped to lampposts. Karen's house remained closed off and still. The once manicured hedges along her walkway had grown unruly, casting long, tangled shadows across the path. A few of the neighbors who had once stood on her lawn with hand-painted slogans now avoided Naomi's gaze when passing by, their greetings, if offered, brief and flat. She didn't resent them. There was no triumph in watching others shift back into quiet avoidance. Naomi hadn't done this for the applause. She had done it because she refused to let someone else decide what her boundaries were. And now, for the first time in months, those boundaries held firm. A few neighbors, though, did approach. Not with fanfare, not with dramatic apologies, but in simple, understated ways that made their meaning clear. One afternoon, a couple from 2 doors down knocked and asked if she had a recommendation for a fencing contractor. Said they were thinking of doing some work on their property line and figured she would know someone reliable. Another time, a woman she barely recognized dropped off a basket of fresh peaches with a note that read, "For the calmest head on the block." Naomi didn't laugh, but she allowed herself the smallest smile as she set the fruit on the counter. She reestablished her routines, not as they had been before the conflict, but as something stronger, more rooted. Her early mornings returned, as did her time spent pruning and rearranging her garden space. She began sketching again, filling notebooks with layout ideas, stone path placements, and shade tree mapping. Not for clients, not for anyone else's approval, but because the act of creation gave shape to stillness. She spent more time in the local nursery, not dodging glances, but talking with the owner about soil types and regional pests. It all felt quiet, unforced, like something being slowly unknotted after too long pulled taut. When the final letter from the court arrived confirming the recorded enforcement of the restraining order and the full processing of restitution, Naomi didn't frame it, didn't tuck it away like a trophy. She placed it in her file drawer under a new label, Resolved. Just that. Not victory or settlement. Simply the word that captured what mattered most. It was done. It had cost her time, energy, sleep, moments she could never reclaim. But it had not cost her the one thing Karen had tried so persistently to undermine: her authority over her own life. Autumn deepened. Leaves began to change. Naomi purchased a fire pit and placed it on the concrete slab where the deep end used to be. One by one, the pieces of her piece came back, not as replicas of what once was, but as new structures, repurposed, deliberate. One night, Evelyn visited again. They sat by the fire with wine, watching sparks drift upward. Evelyn glanced at the planters and the light fixtures now embedded along the perimeter and said, "You really made it yours." Naomi nodded. "I think that's what pissed her off most," she replied. "That I didn't fight on her terms. That I didn't flinch when she needed me to." They clinked glasses gently. There was no fairy tale conclusion, no grand community shift. The neighborhood remained what it was, a mix of decency and cowardice, of those who respected space and those who prodded until they were forced to stop. Naomi didn't expect it to change. She didn't need it to. She had changed. The quiet now was not fragile. It was earned. As the first frost crept in overnight, Naomi covered the lavender and trimmed the remaining herbs. She looked around her yard and didn't think of what had been taken or destroyed. She thought of what had endured, what she had protected, what she had rebuilt, not in spite of the conflict, but because of it. And when she turned to go back inside, she paused once more, glanced toward the gate, and felt nothing but stillness. No dread, no readiness, no expectation, just peace. Uninterrupted, untrespassed, and wholly her own.